You may have heard this claim. It is said, before Eve, Adam had another wife. Her name was Lilith. It is said, she wanted to be equal to Adam. She refused to bow down, and then she left the garden. But here's the problem. The Bible doesn't tell this story. So where did Lilith come from? Was she really Adam's first wife? Or did a new story come about centuries later? And the strangest question, if Lilith is not named in the Bible as Adam's wife, why do people call her Adam's first wife? Today, we will unravel this mystery from beginning to end. It presents a completely different picture. The world was still new. There were humans on earth, and Adam was in the Garden of Eden. But Adam was alone. God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." Here is an important point. The Bible does not yet name Lilith, nor does it mention a first wife. Rather, it moves towards the coming of a woman. God decided to make a suitable companion for Adam. Then the animals were brought before Adam. Adam gave them names, but none of them were suitable companions for Adam. And then, the most important moment of the story came. Adam fell asleep, and God took one of Adam's ribs. Then, he made a woman from the rib and brought her to Adam. Adam looked at her and said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." This woman, in the Bible account, was Adam's wife, but her name has not yet been revealed. And this is where the difference with the later Lilith story begins. On the one hand, the Bible. On the other hand, later Jewish folk tradition. The Bible says, woman was created for Adam, and later she was named Eve. But in a much later Jewish text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, a different story emerges. In this story, Lilith is presented as Adam's first wife. And here the central issue of the story becomes equality. According to tradition, Adam and Lilith were both made from the earth. Lilith's question was, if we are both made of the same clay, then why am I inferior to you? It was a powerful question, but this is not a biblical dialogue. This is a later tradition of Ben Sira, and this difference will help us understand the whole story of today. In the later tradition, Lilith was not a silent woman. She questioned, she disagreed, she argued for her place, and finally, she refuses to bow down to Adam. Here a great contradiction arises in the story. On the one hand, relationship. On the other hand, freedom. On the one hand, being together. On the other hand, her identity, and Lilith, according to tradition, preferred her identity. She left Adam. But here the question arises, did she really become free? Or was the price of this freedom loneliness? And this is the question that takes the story to the next stage. In the later tradition, an extraordinary event is described. Lilith took the holy name of God, and then she left. Adam tried to bring her back, but she did not return. Tradition mentions 3 angels, Sunui, Sinsui, Smangaloth. They were sent after Lilith. The purpose was to bring her back. But when they found her, Lilith refused. She was not ready to go back. Here the story takes a new form. Now Lilith is no longer just Adam's first wife. Now she begins to become a creature outside the garden. And then, horrible traditions begin to arise about her. Time passed, and Lilith's character changed. She was no longer just a rebellious woman. In later Jewish traditions, she began to be associated with the night. She began to be described as a dangerous supernatural creature. And in some traditions, fearful beliefs about newborns were also associated with her. Now a strange change had come. A woman's question became a terrifying story. The character who once spoke of equality, she now became a symbol of fear at night. And this is the great contrast of the story. Until yesterday, she was Adam's companion. Now she was a symbol of fear. But how did this change happen? In ancient Jewish traditions, we find the idea of various protective methods to protect children from Lilith. Amulets were used. The names of certain angels were written on them: Sunoi, Sinsoni, Samanglov. These names became associated with the story of Lilith. On the one hand, the fear of Lilith. On the other hand, the names of angels for protection. But just think, who has the real power here? This character, or this fear that had been created in the minds of the people? And this is the point, where we must understand an important fact. Now let's come to the real question. Is Lilith named in the Bible? Here the answer is both simple and also complex. In an ancient Hebrew text of the Bible, Isaiah 34:14, there is a Hebrew word, Lilith, which some translations present as Lilith. But here too there is no mention of Adam's first wife, no mention of Adam, no mention of the Garden of Eden, no marriage, no wife before Eve. That is, this word in Isaiah does not prove Ben Sira's entire story of Adam and Lilith. This distinction is very important because most people see one word and assume the whole story is part of the Bible. But history is not that simple. Now let's go back to Genesis. God saw Adam alone. God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." Then God made a woman for Adam. She was brought to Adam. Adam made her from his rib and from his flesh. Then the story moves on. The serpent comes. He speaks to the woman. She looks at the fruit of the forbidden tree. She eats the fruit. She gives it to Adam. Adam eats it too. Then the eyes of both of them are opened. They realize their nakedness. And later, Adam names his wife Eve. The Bible says she was the mother of the living. This is the biblical tradition. Here, there is no Lilith. Now the biggest secret of the story is revealed. The famous story of Lilith becoming Adam's first wife does not come from the Bible. It comes out in a later Jewish literary tradition. The name of this text is Alphabet of Ben Sira. This text is not part of the Bible. This is not Genesis. This is not the Torah. This is not the Quran. This is not the Hadith, but a later Jewish literary text. And in this tradition, Lilith is presented as Adam's first wife. This is where the famous Lilith story takes shape. But the story is not over yet, because centuries later, people began to see Lilith differently. Once upon a time, Lilith was feared. Then, she became a supernatural being, and in modern times, some people began to see her in a completely different light. Now she was for them, a symbol of autonomy, a symbol of their own voice, a symbol of their own identity, a symbol of their own decision. The same character, but different times, different meanings, different interpretations. Here we must remember a rule. Don't mistake modern interpretation for ancient reality. If today someone considers Lilith a symbol of freedom, then this is its modern interpretation. It is not necessary that the ancient Jews also saw it in the same way. And this is both the beauty of history and the danger. Now forget Lilith for a moment. Think about your life. Has anyone ever said to you, "Be quiet"? Have you ever felt, "No one understands me"? Have you ever felt, "I have to make my own place"? This is the place where an ancient story connects with your life. Every human being wants to be respected. Every human being wants to have his or her voice heard. Every human being wants to have the right to maintain his or her identity. But here is a dangerous question. Does protecting your identity mean fighting every battle? The most powerful question in Lilith's story is probably not, was she Adam's first wife? The real question is, what does a man become when he feels unappreciated? Sometimes he becomes silent. Sometimes he gets angry. Sometimes he breaks up with a woman. Sometimes he leaves everything behind. And sometimes he takes his ego for his honor. This is the difference that changes lives. Honor says, "Don't humiliate me." Ego says, "Bow down to me." Honor knows its limits. Ego wants to keep others within its limits. And perhaps this is the lesson that Lilith's story forces us to look within ourselves. If you ever feel alone, remember this: being alone is not always the end. Sometimes loneliness gives a person the opportunity to understand themselves. But not every decision made in anger is freedom, and not every injustice endured in silence is patience. The real wisdom in life is to be able to recognize the difference between the two, when to speak, when to be silent, when to forgive, and when to set your limits. So, was Lilith Adam's first wife? According to the Bible, no. The Bible describes Eve as Adam's wife. The story of Lilith as Adam's first wife, later Jewish tradition, especially made famous by the Alphabet of Ben Sira. And perhaps this is the biggest lesson of this whole story. Not everything that is famous is true. Not every ancient story is the Bible. And before accepting every tradition, it is important to know where that tradition came from. But one question from this story is still alive today. When the world thinks you are wrong, what will you do? Be silent? Fight? Give up everything? Or develop enough wisdom to save your honor and your humanity? Because in the end, the real power is not in bending someone else. The real power is for a person to stand with love, reason, and truth without losing their identity. And perhaps the greatest story of Lilith is not that she left Adam, but it is that even after centuries, people are still arguing about her. Because one question is still alive. The stories we hear about others, do we ever even ask how much truth there is in them? This is the difference between fiction and reality. And perhaps the search for truth also begins here.